Well, friends, today I'm going to speak on anesthetic implications of a diabetic parturient. And just to brief you up with the history, before the advent of insulin, pregnancies were very rare in these women because of high rate of perinatal morbidity and mortality. And, well, the things are still the same. We still have it as the most common disorder of pregnancy with type 1 and type 2. And type 2, as we know, accounts for the majority of it. Now, that is exactly what we call gestational diabetes. It is characterized by carbohydrate intolerance that begins or is first recognized during pregnancy. And why it happens? It happens because pregnancy itself is a diabetogenic state with progressive insulin resistance. And this happens because the beta cells, they fail to compensate. And the main contributors for which happen to be the mother is gaining excess weight, and there are counter-regulatory hormones which come from the placenta. So the incidence still ranges very high. I picked up these values from the latest journals, and the global, it seems, is about 7%. That is about 1 in 2 lakh every year, whereas in India we have a slightly higher incidence depending upon the geography and the screening patterns. The prevalence rate is more among those who are elderly and reaching around 35 years of age. So, in antepartum consideration, these women are basically characterized into some risk factors based on their clinical characteristics, and we need to know them. They fall into high risk if they are morbidly obese, they have a first degree relative, they have history of glycosuria, they have a previous history of GDM, glucose intolerance, or they have an infant with macrosomia. Low risk is as follows. And according to another classification which was given by White, it was characterized on the duration, the age, the vascular and the nephrology parameters. And as we go down, the perinatal mortality and morbidity increases in these women. So why do we bother about it? What is the significance of diabetes for the mother and the baby? Well, it has obstetrical issues which are concerning both the mother and the baby. For the mother, as we have already seen, it causes excessive weight gain. There are incidences of hypertensive disorders with a superimposed preeclampsia, and they land up into primary cesarean sections with premature deliveries as well. Whereas neonates, infants born to these mothers, they have got a host of metabolic disorders. They also have neonatal adiposity, which causes birth trauma and shoulder dystocia. We need to see these women before we take them up, and we should know when and how to screen for such women. Well, American Diabetes Association in 2000 felt that due to cost effectiveness, we should only screen moderate to high risk patients. However, in another observational study by Cossen et al., they found that universal screening gives a better result, whereas selective screening misses many of these diabetic mothers. Following this, they thought a screening test at 24 to 28 weeks, as we all know, is recommended, and a 1 hour level should correspond to about 140. If we are more stringent and we go down to 130, it increases the positive predictive values. All those mothers who screen positive should go on for a diagnostic GDM test. Where now these are the current recommendations. They have been given by International Association of Diabetes in Pregnancy Group Consensus Panel, which was held in the year 2010. They strongly went against selective screening. Rather, they added that if a woman is an overt diabetic, she should be screened at the first antenatal visit, and it is important to do a glycosylated hemoglobin on her. If the values are more than 6.5, she should be really taken care of. And these are the recommendations. So once we know that the woman is a diabetic, we can put her on conventional diet. If there are just some impaired values, well, pharmacological treatment is also reserved for those who cannot be controlled, and they could be either with insulin or oral hypoglycemics. Along with this, we need to maintain maternal glucose at home with a target of fasting about 96 and 1 hour 140 going down to 120 at 2 hours. Well, the role of fetal growth measurements by ultrasound is now coming around the corner, and this has come because it is felt that too tight a control may be deleterious in these women. Whereas hyperglycemia is bad, hypo is equally bad. So if you measure their abdominal circumference at 30 weeks of gestation and it falls well within the 75 percentile, it improves the perinatal outcome. Insulin therapy would be recommended for those women who have inadequate glycemic control, or you're restricting and curtailing the mother's diet to a level that she shows ketonurias, or a baby which is now large for gestation. If this mother happens to be on insulin treatment, we recommend non-stress fetal testing and biophysical profiles. Now, the question is, should we use oral agents? If we can use oral agents, imagine it would prevent so many mothers from taking daily pricks. But the safety for long-term health of mother and baby is not yet well established. It is not recommended by American Diabetic Association and American Association of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Glyburide, which is a second generation sulfonylurea, has been found to not significantly cross placenta, and there are trials which are going on with its use. However, it classifies as pregnancy category C by the FDA. Metformin, we all know, is a Boy-Gerner derivative, and it was found that women who were taking this medicine for the treatment of PCOD or obesity and had conception did not have any adverse effect. It is categorized as class B, and a large trial is undergoing with the treatment on metformin and insulin, showing favorable results with metformin, but we have to wait. So if your mother is on these drugs, or she has a poor glycemic control, or she is giving history of a previous adverse obstetrical event, and she has hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, we need to do their fetal assessment regularly. And more so, we have to remember, if we give too tight a control of blood sugars, the women may even have a growth-restricted baby, especially with superadded preeclampsia. So as an anesthetic, where do we come into picture? We are involved as anesthetists if we have to assist vaginal deliveries in terms of giving labor anesthesia, or maybe forceps delivery if the baby is too large for gestation, or for cesarean deliveries, and as a medical emergency in diabetic ketoacidosis. As a pre-anesthetic evaluation, we all know we need to know their class of diabetes and their control of metabolic state. We also need to keep an account of the comorbid conditions, examine their airway and neurological. Airway examination, as we all know, we have seen the previous speaker also, we have heard him, that there could be generalized edema, morbid obesity. Along with that, there could be a limited joint ability, which accounts for a difficult intubation in these women. Well, if your woman has a type 1 diabetes, which is characterized by non-familiar stretcher and joint contractures, she could be having this Prayer's sign, very well known to all of us. This can predispose to even a difficult direct laryngoscopy. C-spine rigidity can account for this, so your plan for general anesthesia should be in place. Along with this, we all know autonomic and peripheral neuropathies can give labile blood pressures, they can cause peripheral neuropathies, and they can have gastroparesis. For fetal concerns, as anesthetists, we must remember that these babies have reduced intervillar space because of large placenta, enlarged villi, glycosylated hemoglobin, shift of ODC to the left, and abnormal Doppler flow velocimetries. We need to examine them for lab investigations. A baseline investigation like hemoglobin is enough, but if the mother shows any renal insufficiency or preeclampsia and cardiac involvement, you have to go in further. During peripartum, we have to know when and how these women should be delivered. So if your mother is having adequate glycemic control, we can wait till term. In my institute, they normally terminate by 38 weeks. If the baby is going into premature delivery, we need to know pulmonary maturity and amniocentesis should be done. And if the estimated birth weight goes beyond 4.5 grams, delivery without labor is indicated. If the fetal weight happens to be between 4 to 4.5 kilograms, you have to assess for risk factors for shoulder dystocia, because shoulder dystocia happens to be very common and it is associated with brachial plexus injury. It is 18 times more common, And the warning signs which should indicate that this woman may have shoulder dystocia are an antenatal clinical pelvimetry before she goes into labor, or the mother is showing signs of cervical dystocia during labor, or she's giving a past history of such an event. Again, I would emphasize that sonographic estimation at size would also help you to gauge whether this woman is going to have shoulder dystocia during the birth of a baby. So if we are called to give analgesia for these women, we all know if the woman is too early in labor, systemic opioids can be used, but we have to keep into account the normal problems. Whereas epidural and CSE are recommended because of the reasons that they decrease catecholamines and they improve the blood flow and they improve the glycemic controls. And glucoregulation can be maintained using the regimes which are given. If your woman happens to land up for a cesarean delivery, the pre-op elective cesarean delivery mandates that you give the usual dose of insulin in the night. Fasting sugars less than 120, you have to treat. Fasting sugars are less than 120, you can take them up. But do remember, the insulin doses have to be decreased post-operatively with hourly plasma glucose monitoring. In the operating room, we have to be very careful about a good IV line, evaluate serum glucose again, and maintain strict asepsis. There are case reports in literature with epidural catheter and infection in gestational diabetes. For general anesthesia, I'll highlight again gastroparesis, limited atlanto-occipital joints, increased hemodynamic response to intubation, and impaired counter-regulatory response to hypoglycemia during sleep. Regional anesthesia, again, it's just to revise that we have to avoid hypotension, avoid aortocaval compression, maintain oxygenation, and maintain hydration. Choice of local anesthetic doesn't really matter. What matters is dosing of epidural catheter. Probably if you are using epidural, you can go in for small increments, and at the same time, you must ensure adequate block height because the women may require forceps or cesarean delivery. You have to maintain normoglycemia, that goes without saying. In a study, they found that clearance of local anesthetic was delayed in gestational diabetes. Here in this study, when they used 20 ml, they found that the recovery was slightly delayed in these women. And along with this, you have to look for clinical evidence of fetal hypoxia, which can be presented during intrapartum abnormal FHRs or ST depression on fetal ECG during labor. Post-delivery, you can see cord blood acidosis and lower Apgar scores. Earlier, there were concerns that neonates born after regional may have fetal acidosis, and the reasons were because there was lactic acid production due to a large placenta or elevated fetal blood glucose, which can contribute to neonatal acidosis. However, there are two reports which are very old, which I found in the literature. They showed that if you maintain normotension, avoid glucose-containing solutions, these problems are largely taken care of, and infants born under spinal anesthesia do not have any fetal acidosis. So when we come to this, how do we come across them as diabetic emergencies, and what do we do as anesthetists? Well, we see them in diabetic ketoacidosis, and once we see a woman with diabetic ketoacidosis, it should be clearly marked admit to ICU, because they present with dehydration, ketosis, acidosis, and it could be triggered by the woman doesn't give history, she just comes, she is an undiagnosed diabetic, or she has stopped taking her insulin, there is some infection, or your obstetric colleagues have started some interventions. So why do we need to bother about the mother? Because this dehydration can predispose to hypotension, acidosis, organ dysfunction, electrolyte imbalance, can cause cardiac arrhythmias, whereas the baby can have acidemia because of decreased uterine blood flow, shift of maternal ODC, and you can have a non-reassuring fetal heart race. Say we have a woman who comes decompensated, she comes in emergency, and she has a non-reassuring fetal heart race. We are called to do an emergency C-section. In such scenarios, it is recommended that the maternal condition be stabilized and fetal intervention is taken after that. Because if you try to take out the baby, the mother's condition is going to worsen. Whereas if you treat the mother, it is a possibility that FHR is going to revert back. So remember, if a mother comes to you with DKA and emergency cesarean section, we have to correct the metabolic condition of the mother. So I end by saying that some practice points would be: untreated and undiagnosed mild hyperglycemia is associated with adverse pregnancy outcomes. We must screen these women at the first antenatal visit. We must ensure adequate glycemic control, and we must carefully plan anesthetic technique with multidisciplinary approach. Thank you.